Good evening and welcome. I am Melanie Ramey, the chair of the board of the Madison Committee on Foreign Relations, and it's my pleasure to welcome you this evening to this very, very special presentation. Before we hear this evening's program, I do want to mention that on May the 10th, which is a Monday, we will also have another very interesting program, which will be our final program of the season. With us at that time will be Dr. Aaron Rock Singer, a professor of history, Middle East history at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And Dr. Singer is a world-renowned authority on the Middle East, and he will be talking with us about the future of foreign aid. He'll be talking to us about the future of the role of Islam, particularly in Egypt. And it's a very interesting history involved there, and it's also very germane to what's happening in Egypt at this particular time. So we want to be sure that you have that on your calendar, and you'll be getting more information from us about it. But we want to focus this evening on our program, which we are very, very fortunate to have with us Professor Steven Radelet, Dr. Radelet from Georgetown University. And I would also mention to you that there is an icon at the bottom of your screen, the chat icon. And if you will click on that, there will open a page or a place on the right of your screen where you can put your questions. And as Dr. Radelet is speaking, if you have questions, please put them there, and then we will give them to him as he finishes, and he will respond to them. It's a good fortune that he is able to be with us. Dr. Radelet is professor of global human development at Georgetown University, where he holds the McHenry Chair in global human development and is its distinguished practitioner of that practice. Dr. Radelet has extensive experience in foreign aid. He has served as the chief economist as USAID program. He served as undersecretary for the state under Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, and he has worked with particularly with interesting work with other developing countries around the world. For 4 years, he was a senior advisor to the government of Indonesia and their Department of Finance. He also served 2 years as a senior advisor to the government of the Gambia, and he currently serves as advisor to the government of Liberia. So we could not have anyone more experienced with this topic that we've been very concerned about, particularly with the change in administration in this country. So Dr. Radelet will then help us understand this better as he talks with us about the future of foreign aid and the role of the United States in the world. Dr. Radelet.
Thank you, Melanie. Thanks everybody for being here. Thanks to April for helping put this together, and I really appreciate the kind introduction. I had the great pleasure of speaking to this group live. I think it was about 7 or 8 years ago, and it's much more fun when it's live. But I'm glad that I could join you today. I'm at my home outside of Washington, D.C. in Northern Virginia, and I suppose if there's any advantage to this crazy time that we live in, it's that we've all learned how to use Zoom and we can connect people from around the world. And so it makes it easy for me to join you today, and I'm really pleased to be able to do so. I'm happy to talk about foreign aid and the role of the United States in the world, particularly in developing countries, and the future of foreign aid today. There are a lot of misunderstandings of foreign aid held by the American people in terms of how much foreign aid there is, what it's used for, what it does. And I want to try to to address some of those concerns, and try to answer some of the questions that you've got. April, I think you have to take your screen down. There we go, and then I can put my screen up, and we'll go from there. Okay. I hope everyone can see this screen. So I want to talk about the future of foreign aid, the role of the United States in the world. And I want to start with this quote, which kind of sums it up from Colin Powell in a editorial that he wrote in the New York Times 4 years ago. America is great when we're the country that the world admires, a beacon of hope and a principled people who are generous, fair, and caring. That's the American way. If we're still that nation, then we must continue to devote the small but strategic 1% of our federal budget to this mission. And he was talking about not just foreign aid, but actually foreign affairs, the entire State Department budget, and all of the foreign aid budget as well. And this is his view of what it takes for America to be great. So I wanted to start with that slide. I want to talk about several different things here. First, I want to focus on what's happening in low income and middle income countries around the world, what are often called developing countries, the poorest countries in the world. Because a lot of people believe that there's never any progress, nothing goes right, that the poor countries around the world are stuck in poverty and conflict and disease and everything else. But the truth is that the last 25 years has seen more progress in development than any time in human history. So I want to talk a little bit about that. Then I want to talk about why the United States focuses on foreign aid, why it is in the interest of the United States government to actually have a foreign aid program. Talk about that for a few minutes. Then we'll talk about some of the data, some of the numbers on foreign aid, some of the myths about foreign aid. I'll address those. I'll have a little bit of a word about China, and then talk a little bit about the future of foreign aid. So that's what I'm going to do over the next little while, and then open it up for questions and discussion from all of you. So looking at these next slides here, I want to focus on progress over the last 25 years. And this first slide shows the share of people in the world living in poverty, in extreme poverty, living less than $1.90 a day, if you can imagine living on that amount of money, less than about $2 a day, which is the global poverty line as defined by the World Bank. And you can see on the left here, in 1981, let me get my pointer going here. In 1981, we had over 50% of the world, 50% of people in the world were living on less than $1.90 a day. It's actually hard to fathom, not that long ago. But you can see the percentage of people living in poverty falling really rapidly. And we're now down to about 10% of the people in the world living in extreme poverty. That's still too high. 10% is way too high. But this drop from 50% to 10% is unprecedented in world history. There's never, ever been anything like this in world history. It's driven in many ways by China is a big part of this, and the reduction in poverty in China. It's such a big country with so many people. And in India, but it's not just a couple countries. This is happening in 50, 60 countries around the world, from Brazil to Tanzania to South Africa to Sri Lanka, Indonesia, the Philippines, and many, many more. This is a global phenomenon, not in all countries. There are still many countries left behind, but we have seen many, many countries move literally billions of people out of poverty over the last 20 years. So that's poverty. I wanted to show a slide here on health, particularly on child health. This slide shows what's known as child mortality, the share of children dying before age 5. In 1960 over here, we can see that 19% of children in developing countries died before their 5th birthday. Just think about that for a minute. 1 out of 5 children dying before their 5th country, all around, or their 5th birthday, all around the world. And this was fairly common actually in Europe. If you go back to before the Industrial Revolution, Great Britain, actually in the early 19th century, 25, 30% of children died before their 5th birthday. And even in the United States, 20 or 30 years, 50 years ago, it was much more common to hear of children dying when they were young. Today, instead of 19% of children dying before their 5th birthday, we're down to 4%, 1 out of 25, which is still too high. It's still incredibly tragic. But this drop from 19% to 4% means that 15% of children that are now born would have died, and they now live. And they live longer, they live healthier, they live out of poverty. This decline in child mortality, in my opinion, this is one of the greatest achievements ever in world history. Most people are unaware of it. They take it for granted. It's happened because of vaccines. It's happened because of clean water, better nutrition, higher incomes for people as they come out of poverty. There are a lot of reasons for it, but this is actually astonishing. And as I said, I consider it one of the greatest achievements in human history. And most people are unaware that it's even happened. Here's what's happening on education. Just one slide. This shows the share of girls who complete primary school. Well, completing primary school is not such a big deal. These days we take it for granted, but of course, not that long ago, it was a big deal. And in 1972, less than 40% of girls in developing countries completed primary school. Now we're up to almost 90%. And so almost all girls are at least getting a primary school education. Not quite all, and we've got to do better. But this changes all kinds of things to educate women, to create opportunities for girls, because first of all, it obviously helps these girls. It increases their chances of having a higher income. Girls who complete primary school get married later. Girls who complete primary school have fewer children. Their children are healthier. Their children are more likely to go to school, and their children have higher income. There's a powerful intergenerational effect, and all of us who have mothers know how powerful that impact is. And so we're educating more and more mothers and more women around the world. And this gives me great hope for the next generation. When people think about what's happening in the future, we have already set a really strong foundation because we're now educating 90% of girls at least through primary school, and many of them, of course, go on to secondary school. So that bodes well for their children and for the next generation as we look forward. So this is actually a very positive note. Here's a political slide. This is the number of countries that are considered electoral democracies by Freedom House, just a count of countries around the world. You can see in 1990, not that long ago, there are only about 75 countries around the world. Out of around 200, there are about 190 countries in the world, countries and territories. 75 were considered electoral democracies. It got up as high as around 120, 125. We've never seen so many countries that have that have adopted democracy. And I don't necessarily mean Western democracy and all of its problems, and ours certainly has its problems, but a chance for people to choose their leaders, hold them accountable, and have more voice in what happens to them, as well as have basic rights that are honored. This number has fallen in the last few years. There is what is known as a democratic recession. More and more countries that were democracies are falling backwards away from it. There are a lot of reasons for that. Partly it is a failure of leadership of the United States and the weaknesses of our own democracy. And more countries are saying, hey, if the United States is adopting practices that are not democratic, we can too. And partly it has the rise of Russia and people trying to emulate China. There are a lot of reasons for this, and I'm quite worried about it. But hopefully, if the United States can regain its global leadership, then this trend will begin to reverse itself. Here's a slide that talks about conflict. Lots of people believe that we live in one of the most violent times in world history. In fact, we live in one of the most peaceful times in world history, at least if you count deaths in war and battle deaths. This goes back to World War II and shows different kinds of, the different colors are different kinds of conflicts. The red is conflicts between states. The green is civil conflicts. The purple is civil conflicts when you have a foreign state intervention. They're different kind of wars and conflicts. But obviously in the 1940s with World War II, there were many battle deaths. Again, in the 1960s and 70s with conflicts around the world, of course, in Southeast Asia, around Vietnam, but conflicts around Asia, in Indonesia, in China, there was conflict. There were conflict in Pakistan and Afghanistan, in West Africa, many armies at each other, chopping their arms off of child soldiers. South Africa was a mess around apartheid, many other conflicts that spread through the 60s, 70s, and into the 80s. At the end of the Cold War, the level of violence declined. The number of deaths in war declined quite a bit. And actually in the early 2000s, it was at one of the lowest levels in human history. It has sparked up again because of the conflicts in Syria and in South Sudan, in Yemen, and several other places. And those are incredible tragedies, and I certainly do not want to suggest that they are no big deal. But even with those conflicts, we still are at one of the lowest levels of violence in human history. So violence is much better. So those are just some of some snapshots of progress amongst developing countries. And the point of it is it is false to believe that countries are not making progress. It's false to believe that poverty cannot be attacked and be reduced. It is false to believe that we can't do more to fight disease and to fight conflict and to fight bad governance. We've made enormous progress in the last 25 years. There's a lot more to be done, for sure, and not everyone has been reached, and not all countries are succeeding, but we have been living in the last 25 years in the period of the greatest progress in human history in terms of the widespread effect of billions of people around the world, not just Western Europe, not just the United States, but the greatest progress for the most people ever recorded in human history. So that's sort of the first part of what I wanted to talk about. Second part is, why should the United States care? Why should, as a government, as individuals, it's one question, but it's a different question about our elected officials with taxpayer money representing the country, the government of the United States. Why should we care? And I think there are 5 really important reasons why the United States should care about and should support the poorest countries in the world. First of all, this enhances American security, just from a pure selfish point of view, just being selfish. This is in our interest to help the poorest countries in the world, because when those countries are unstable and they are poor, we end up with places like Afghanistan that have spillover effects to the United States. We have wars in Sudan and wars in conflicts in East Africa where U.S. embassies are attacked and destroyed. We have instability around the world, which we know spills over and adversely affects our interest in terms of terrorism, in terms of fighting, in terms of war. Whether we should get into those conflicts, that's a big question, but whether we do or not, they affect us in very big ways. So by getting engaged with countries around the world, it helps enhance our security. That doesn't mean we run off and get engaged in every war that's out there. But those conflicts do have impacts on our national security in very big ways. The second reason is that by helping other countries, we build alliances that help us fight global challenges like terrorism, global challenges like drug trafficking, global challenges like climate change, global challenges like pandemic diseases. And if we want to stop the next pandemic, it's not just up to us. The pandemics don't honor borders. They don't stop at customs. They don't carry passports. And if we're going to stop the next pandemic, it is absolutely in our selfish interests to help other countries to build strong health systems in their countries so that they can help fight disease on their end, as well as us doing it on our end. And if that doesn't happen, we're not going to be able to fight those diseases. We're not going to be able to stop international drug trafficking and crime networks. We're not going to be able to stop climate change. We can't do that on our own. Any of the big challenges that the United States faces, we need allies. And we need our traditional allies, but we also need the help of countries, some of the poorest countries in the world, to fight terrorism, to fight drug trafficking, to fight against HIV/AIDS, as well as to fight against this pandemic and other kinds of things. We cannot go it alone. And we cannot just retract into some kind of bubble. So we need to help build alliances. The third is to reduce incentives for migration. Lots of concern in the United States about migration, particularly from Central America. The solution to that is certainly not building walls, and it's certainly not putting kids in jail cells. The solution to that is making the incentives clear for people to stay where they're from. People don't want to migrate, actually, all else being equal. They want to stay home. They want to stay with their families. They want to stay in their country. They want to stay in a place where they're comfortable and where they can live the rest of their life. But they move because they don't have economic opportunity. They move because of conflict and war. They move because of poor governance. And if we're ever going to stop migration, we need to help countries to achieve progress so it becomes much more attractive for people to stay there, which is what people want to do. That's the only way to stop this. And so it is in our interest, again, to help Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, El Salvador, for them to make progress, create jobs, create economic opportunities, help create political freedoms for people so that people have an incentive to stay. It used to be that Mexico was one of the biggest sources of migration to the United States. Not anymore. It's a through point. Why? Because people stay in Mexico because they have good jobs. They can stay there. It's safe, it's stable, and they have good jobs. So they don't leave anymore. And that's the kind of thing that needs to happen in countries around the world to reduce migration. Fourth, helping poor countries helps U.S. commercial interests. We've got all kinds of businesses that operate around the world, whether it's software companies, whether it's Boeing, whether it's computer companies, whether it's clothing companies, whatever it is, with markets around the world. And as poor countries become richer, we buy more of their stuff, they buy more of our stuff. And from just a simple commercial business point of view, it is helpful for American businesses to have countries around the world that are thriving and can buy our goods. And then the fifth one, put aside the U.S. national interest, security, put aside everything I've said so far is to point out that this is in our selfish interest. But of course, it's more than that. We should do this because it's the right thing to do, because we are the richest, most powerful country in the history of the planet. And if we are unable to just help out people that are poorer than us, people that are struggling to earn more incomes for their families, people that are struggling to get their kids in school, people that are struggling to give their girls a fair shake in life, then it's just not right. There's something wrong with us. So the first four of my points here are about our selfish interests, but the fifth one is that it's just morally and ethically, I deeply believe it is the right thing for the people of the United States to do. And we should be doing it privately through our own gift giving and the contributions that we make, but we should also be doing it collectively as a statement of our values as a society, that we believe that this is the right thing to do. So those are, to me, the five big reasons why the United States should be deeply engaged in working with poor countries around the world. I want to talk about some myths about foreign aid now, and a little bit of some numbers and some data that I want to try to dispel, but I hear these myths all the time. First is, a lot of people believe that the United States spends a huge amount of money on foreign aid. If you add, there are surveys, lots of surveys after surveys, asking people how much they believe the federal budget has that gives away to other countries in terms of foreign aid. And people believe it's 15 to 25% of the budget. It's usually, the belief is around 20% of the federal budget people believe is given away in foreign aid. And then a lot of the surveys will then ask people, well, okay, if that's too much, how much should we give? And people will say 5, 6, 7%. That would be a good number that we give away. Well, truth is that we give, our foreign aid is less than 1% of the federal budget. This pie here represents the entirety of the federal budget, and about 23% down here for Social Security, about the same amount for Medicare and Medicaid. We've got national defense down at the bottom here, 15% of the budget. We've got domestic discretionary spending, which everybody thinks we give away, food stamps and everything else. It's just 14% of the budget. We've got interest on the foreign debt, 8.5%. Other things, 14%. Here's our international budget up here, 0.79%. This is all foreign affairs. This is the State Department and all of our diplomatic missions, as well as what we sometimes call poverty-focused development aid. That's this PFDA here, is within, it's 0.8% of our budget. It's a sliver of our budget, and yet most Americans believe that's 20% of the budget. It's kind of laughable. And then people say, well, they'd be perfectly happy if it was 5 or 6%. Well, since I'm working this business, I would be thrilled if it was 5 or 6% or 2% or 3% or anything. I'd be happy if it was 1%, but it's about 0.5%. And even when you include the State Department, it's less than 1% of the budget. That's the first myth. The second is this a myth that the United States is the most generous country in the world in its contributions to foreign aid. We're the most generous. And that view is derived from this fact, which is, well, as all facts, it's a true fact. The US does provide more foreign aid through its government budget than any other country in terms of dollar amounts. In 2020, the United States provided $35 billion in foreign aid. Next up was Germany, $25 billion. 19 billion from the United Kingdom. Those are the 3 countries that provide the most dollars. So if you ask a lot of people, that's it. We're the most generous country in the world. Well, it would be a little odd if we didn't give more money than the United Kingdom and Germany, since we're a lot bigger and we're a lot richer than those countries. And as a share of our total income, we actually give much less. So here's the second fact. The United States gives 0.16%, 1/6 of 1% of our national income. 1/6 of 1% of our national income goes to foreign aid. Less than 1% of the budget, but 1/6 of 1% of our national income, ranking us 23rd amongst countries. We're just behind Slovenia in terms of how much we give as a share of our income. So we don't give that much at all. Myth number 3, most foreign aid goes to corrupt governments. Well, most foreign aid doesn't go to any governments, corrupt or not corrupt. Most foreign aid is not given to governments. It's given to US organizations. It's given to international non-government organizations, NGOs, Save the Children, Mercy Corps, global communities, big groups like that, World Vision, and multilateral organizations, the World Bank, the United Nations, which in turn administer the programs that are focused on the poor and low-income countries. We don't give money, except in rare, we do sometimes, but most of our money does not go to governments. And yet people believe that most foreign aid is just given to a dictator and they go out and buy Mercedes-Benz. Used to be more of that, particularly during the Cold War in the 70s and the 80s, when frankly, we did write a lot of big checks to very corrupt governments, as long as they were on the side, our side in the Cold War. Whether it was the Duvaliers in Haiti or whether it was Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines or Suharto in Indonesia or many other dictators around the world. We used to do that, but we don't anymore. Starting in the 1990s, most of the foreign aid actually has gone through organizations that administer these programs on our behalf. Myth number 4, well, it doesn't work. It's all a big failure, no progress. Well, I've already shown you the great progress in many countries around the world. And academic research backs this up. It shows that, well, some programs don't work. It's true. I can find failures. I can find failures in anything. The research shows that foreign aid has actually had a statistically significant positive impact on helping to increase incomes, reduce poverty, to improve health, advance education, and strengthen governance in low-income countries. Missing a letter there. So the research shows that overall aid works. Not everything, not every program, but overall aid does work. So there's a myth, and you'll find all kinds of books written by people who will tell all kinds of stories about the failures of aid, and they're cherry picking bad stories. And people who say things are broken and things fail always get more attention than people who actually tell the more complicated story about how things work, but they're maybe not a moonshot, but they work fairly well. The truth is always more complicated than a story that just is bashing and says something fails. But the story that is bashing that says something fails gets enormous amounts of press. And I've noticed this in foreign aid, where you can get 10, 12 research papers, really well done research papers that shows that foreign aid has a positive effect. They get no press whatsoever. One study comes out and says that it doesn't work, and it's headlines in the newspapers and in Washington, D.C. So most of the research, and I have spent many, many, many years working on this research, reading it, contributing to it. Most of the research shows that that foreign aid does in fact have a positive impact. I would be remiss, though, to leave you with the impression that it is foreign aid that is the main driver of all this development progress. I showed you earlier the big reductions in poverty, the improvements in health. Foreign aid has definitely helped, for sure, but the main driver is the people in those countries themselves. It's the leadership of those countries themselves, and we would be giving too much credit to ourselves if we said that we are responsible for all this great progress around the world. We have helped, for sure, but the main driver are the actions and the decisions made by the people in those countries themselves to overcome a lot of these hardships. Let me turn really to my last question. What about China? Lots of discussion about China in this space, and something what they call the Belt and Road Initiative, in which through their building lots of infrastructure, energy infrastructure, power stations, electrical grids, a lot of roads, a lot of ports. This diagram just shows some of the ports and some of the roads that they're building around the world. And very controversial because we don't trust China, frankly. We worry that the Chinese are exporting their own views, that they don't support democracy, that they would actually give money to dictators, and that they're doing all of this for their own interests and not for the people in these countries. First of all, when I hear this, I think of Casablanca and the line, I'm shocked to find gambling in here, and sir, here are your winnings. The United States has given a lot of money to dictators over the years. We've given a lot of money to countries where we didn't care at all if they were a democracy or not, certainly before the Cold War. We threw away a lot of money to support nasty dictators. So even if those complaints against China are correct, it's nothing that we haven't done ourselves over the years. So that's one thing. But second of all, it's unfair to China, frankly. I'm no China apologist. I have a lot of concerns about the rise of China, although I will say it is remarkable that we have had the rise of a great power so far peacefully in a way that really has never happened in world history before. And I actually believe in the long run, we have more in common, more interests in common with China than problems. But it's not fair to, some of the concerns are correct, but here's what's not fair about it. They're building a lot of roads, and they're building a lot of ports, and they're building a lot of electricity systems, and they're building a lot of hospitals. And this is good stuff. And this is really important for people that are trying to fight poverty. There are people that are trying to get jobs that need electricity, that need hospitals that work, that need ports that are efficient. They need roads that are paved for all the same reasons that we do. And we're not doing it as much as they are these days. We still give more foreign aid than they do in most countries. But in a lot of countries, they are stepping up and providing the kind of assistance that the countries want and that we're not providing as much. And so this is really helpful, actually, to a lot of countries. I worked for many years in Liberia with President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, and with her met with the Chinese government many times, and they were doing really good stuff to help. And when it works well, actually, President Sirleaf was able to actually bring together the Chinese ambassador and bring together the US ambassador and actually get them to cooperate. And I remember one project, it was a hospital project, and the Chinese were building the hospital, and the United States helped provide all the equipment in the hospital, because we didn't have money to build the building, but we did have money to buy the equipment and a lot of the drugs. And they had money for the building, but not for the drugs. And President Sirleaf pulled them all, everybody in together and said, let's cooperate. And we did, and it was a great thing for the people of Liberia. So there's a lot of good things that come out of these relationships with China. Having said that, there are concerns. In many countries, they bring a lot of Chinese workers with them. In Zambia in particular, they brought a lot of people to work in the mines and other kinds of things. They don't care about governance very much, and they are perfectly happy to support dictators in a way that we used to, but in a way that we don't do as often anymore. So there are concerns about governance and their ability and willingness to kind of support dictators and not push for democracy. So I don't at all want to be an apologist. It's complicated, but it is not a one-sided story. And I have seen too many good things from these investments that are actually really helping people to just completely discount it. Let me just talk for a couple more minutes on kind of where to from here in the future of foreign aid. And then I will stop and turn it back to Melanie and open it up for questions. So going forward, foreign aid, I think, is going to remain critical for achieving our security goals, especially fighting pandemic, disease, and climate change. I think the pandemic is doing two big things in terms of this issue, foreign aid. One is, of course, budgets are tighter. We don't have as much money. But on the other hand, I think there's a growing recognition, especially with people who pay close attention to this, of how important it is to build the institutions and strengthen other countries for our own protection. And that's kind of a growing recognition that began around disease, that began to start 30 years ago with HIV/AIDS, and the recognition that it was in our own interest to help stem that pandemic as much as possible. And that led to first the Clinton administration, but then the Bush administration in a very big way, starting what's called the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, which is now financing 18 million people around the world that are on antiretrovirals and that are alive because of this program. But it's also building health institutions that have helped slow the spread of HIV/AIDS. And then this took off further, more recognition around SARS, around H1N1, and of course around Ebola, and a recognition around Ebola in Liberia. And I was working in Liberia during that time, that the real key to stopping those kinds of diseases was stopping them where they started. And the key to that was helping to build the health systems in those countries. And I believe, and I hope with the pandemic, that if there's a silver lining that's coming out of this, is that we will recognize the importance of helping to build the health institutions in countries around the world. So I think that's going to be a big focus going forward. And another big focus going forward, of course, is going to be climate change, because again, we can't handle that alone. Some of the countries, the poorest countries in the world that have made progress are very vulnerable because of climate change to major steps backwards. And I'm really worried, actually, for countries in Northern Africa, around just south of the Sahara Desert, what's known as the Sahel, Chad, where the president was murdered on Monday night, and other countries along the southern edge of the desert there that are very, very vulnerable to climate change. And so if we don't help those countries and work with those countries, we could see millions more people go back into poverty, and more instability, more migration, and all kinds of other problems. So I think we're going to see a greater focus on climate change as belatedly more people in the United States recognize that this is real and this is a global threat, and I'm hoping to see more. And I'm hoping to see more focus and greater focus in the future on strengthening governance and helping to build political systems, because at the end of the day, it's the political systems that build the institutions that set the norms for behavior and make the decisions for countries. And the United States has done a lot to help strengthen governance in a lot of countries, and I think in the future we'll do even more. So I think these are going to be three key areas of focus. Another trend I think we're going to see is that as incomes in low-income countries themselves rise, and therefore their tax revenues, this is going to shift from, in many countries, from us just giving foreign aid to us actually co-financing and working as partners with countries as they have more wherewithal to help co-finance a power generation project or a road project or a hospital project. And that we, the United States and other aid donors, it's going to become much more of a cooperative relationship, less of us just doing all the work, and those countries, as their incomes rise, much more of a partnership. And we're beginning to see this in some countries. We're beginning to see this in South Africa. We're beginning to see this in India, in Indonesia, in the Philippines, countries that the incomes have begun to rise. And I think we're going to see more and more of this in the coming years. And it's really actually an exciting trend where it will be less of us dictating what we do and more as partnerships. And then related to that, it's not just about the money, it's about skill levels. And skill levels are rising in so many countries around the world. More programs are going to be designed and managed by skilled local staff and less by Americans. And that's a good thing. That's going to be an adjustment. People like me, it's going to be harder in many ways for Americans to work in this space, although it's not going to go away for sure. But the good thing is that there are many more skilled people. I'm training a bunch in my master's program at Georgetown, and they are having the skills to manage and administer their own programs. So these are some of the big future trends that I see, that it's really continues to be important in the United States. If we don't get that, it's going to come back and bite us, and it's going to be worse for us. I think we're going to be focusing on pandemics, disease, climate change, and strengthening governance. And I think we're going to move towards more partnerships and more responsibility and leadership where it belongs, in the low-income countries themselves, as their incomes rise and as their skill levels rise. So let me stop there. Let me take this down, and Melanie, hand it back over to you. I think you're on mute, Melanie, so it's over to you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, there we go. You're good.
Yeah, you mentioned and talked about China. The question is, what sort of foreign aid does Russia have? What do they do in terms of other countries?
Very little. It's a good question. It's a very small amount. We don't know the numbers because they don't publish them. We actually don't know that much about China's numbers because they don't publish them either. But there's some research that tries to track it down, so we know a little bit. We don't know much about Russia. A lot of it is what they do give is military aid, not development aid. They give some to the countries that surround them, the countries in Eastern Europe, some development aid, but not much, and very, very little in countries beyond that. You will hear occasionally about the Russians helping finance a power plant or some other thing, but it's a tiny amount. So they're not really a player in this space.
Mm-hmm. Another question about the approach, like the USAID approach of helping the countries so that people won't feel that they have to leave there to have some sort of security. How has that worked? It seems like, particularly in the Central American countries, Honduras and some of those countries where we're seeing a lot of people coming into the United States, has this just not been possible to strengthen those situations, or what's the difference?
Yeah, so it's a good question. And there was progress in the early 90s and the early 2000s after the nasty civil wars that we all remember, the civil wars in the 1980s across Central America. And that ended in the 1990s. Things were much calmer and much more stable. And so there was less migration into the United States. But those countries have become more unstable. There's been more violence. There's less war, and there's more gang violence, and people don't feel safe. It's hard to get jobs, again, because of the violence. And so because of the failures in security and the failures of building the government institutions there, people don't feel safe and they can't get jobs, and so they come here. So I don't want to make it sound easy because it's not, but the core of the problem is helping to build the security and the good institutions and the job creation in those countries.
You know, you were mentioning also another reason people leave their countries is because of wars. And it seems that a lot of countries have a lot of internal wars that go on. How do we choose which side to get on, you know? And yeah. I guess Afghanistan is a classic example of that, but you see in Somalia, you see in Chad, you see in other places, the internal strife. And these are countries where we have had aid programs and so forth. So what do we do when this sort of thing happens?
Right. So it's a good question, and of course I'm no expert on civil war per se and the politics of how the United States chooses sides, and we can all I think pretty quickly acknowledge sometimes we are on the right side, sometimes we're on the wrong side. A lot of times we pick the side that is in our national security interests, but I won't go into there because that's not really our topic. But your question is really about on foreign aid, and it's really a challenge actually, because obviously in a conflict environment, it's much harder to deliver assistance, number one, because it's more costly. You need security, it's much more expensive, and people who are actually delivering aid, their lives are deeply threatened. So it's much harder. It can also be misused. And by that, I mean, if you're delivering assistance to people who are victims, or that their country is at war, that aid, if it's food in particular, can actually come under the control of warring parties, and they can actually use this to their own benefit and use it to leverage people. They can steal it, they can take it from people, and so there is a risk when we give food aid in deep conflict environments that can be misused. This is the hardest thing of all, because there's never a clear answer when to get involved, on whose side, even if you're neutral, how to do it. And these are some of the bravest people we have that are working in these war zones and trying to help the most vulnerable people at the core of it. So there's no easy answer to your question. Each time something like this happens, there's a lot of people get involved in the decision-making process, a big deliberative process, bringing together State Department, the Defense Department, the National Security Council, the White House, the USAID, and others to try to make those decisions through the National Security Council. And each case is really different and really complicated. So no easy answers. I see a question in the chat room, if I can turn to that one, Melanie. There's a question here. It says, my discussion of China and the Belt and Road Initiative didn't acknowledge problem in Sri Lanka's ports. Yep, that's right. I didn't. And in Juba and the airports and the financing problems threaten loss of sovereignty. So that is a good, and it's a good point. Thank you for raising that. And these are cases in which the Chinese government lent money to, say, the port in Sri Lanka to build a port, but they actually were able to hold it as collateral. The port actually is collateral against the government repaying them as loans. So these were loans, not grants, given to the government. And when the government fell into hard times financially, they were unable to repay the loans. And so the government of China has actually taken control of the ports, raising big issues of sovereignty. And that is a big problem. And it's true that there are cases of this where this has happened. The United States, we don't do that. We don't take over the assets. We do require that people pay us back. And what we have, the channel we have used instead is through the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, particularly 20 or 30 years ago, essentially countries going through strong austerity programs in order to repay their debts. We then moved into a program in the 1990s where we forgave a lot of those debts. And essentially, we forgave a lot of debts to the poorest countries. So this practice, which you point out, is very different. It's something we haven't done and is a big problem. There's no excuse for that. And there is a movement to really stop countries, the governments of Sri Lanka and the governments of South Sudan, from entering into these agreements in the first place. It's just a really bad mistake to get into an agreement where you collateralize that kind of asset that you could give it over to a foreign government. But thank you for raising the question. It's a good one. Back to you, Melanie.
Yeah. When we and China are both aiding a country, is there any pressure brought on that government to choose, choose us or choose China, or how do governments deal with the two sort of competing interests like that?
That's a good question, and it varies quite widely. So when you have a capable leader like Ellen Johnson Sirleaf in Liberia, she basically is able to take control and bring, as I told the story, bring people together and they'll work on it. And I saw her with the Chinese actually insist that they follow procurement rules, contracting rules, open bidding processes, all of the open best practices, and the Chinese government saying, okay, if those are the rules, we'll do it. But I also know of other cases in other countries where the government is open to be bribed, and the Chinese government saying, okay, if that's the way you do business, we're happy to do that as well. Now, in terms of your question, bringing pressure together, I guess my key point on that, a lot of that depends on the government itself, the host government. And where it works best is where you have a capable government that's actually able to manage both of them. But in the absence of that, and in many countries, there is an absence. Sometimes there's cooperation and sometimes there's competition. There still is cooperation in countries where it is in the United States and China's mutual interest to have a country succeed. But there's also competition, and one side trying to trying to get the other country to choose. Yeah, I think too much in the United States, when we hear this competition from China, our reaction is to denigrate China, say they're all corrupt, that China itself is corrupt and dictators, when that may be true. But I wish that our response was to also, at the same time, while we criticize China, to up our game, not just to criticize them, but to say, well, we're going to do better. We're going to deliver more financing to help build roads and ports and things like that to help this country so they don't get in that bind with China. My hope and view would be that we not only criticize, but in the competition that we actually step up and that we help finance this stuff ourselves, which would be helpful to the country and help reduce Chinese influence in a more direct way.
You know, there are a lot of NGO organizations in the world, and we see them in refugee camps and in all these very difficult situations. Is part of our foreign aid, or does part of our foreign aid go to support those organizations,
actually, yes,
the refugee camps?
Yes, and some of it goes directly, that the United States government does it directly, and some of it we do through UN organizations and other groups. But we are a big funder of many of the large organizations that work in refugee camps around the world, whether it's Save the Children or Mercy Corps or the UN organizations, the UN High Commission for Refugees, or many of the other UN agencies, or many other international NGOs that work in refugees. My wife's organization, Global Communities, works with the Rohingya up in Bangladesh, and that's through US funding. So a lot of that does come from US foreign aid. And we actually, that's one of the things the United States does pretty well. We're pretty good when we set our mind to it about getting emergency assistance in and food and water for people who need it. And in an emergency after an earthquake or a volcano, but also in longer term issues with refugees. Some of these are so hard, and people that are caught between two governments, the Rohingya being a perfect example, that they're unwanted in Myanmar, they're unwanted in Bangladesh, neither side will take them, and they're stuck in this no man's land, now being moved out to an island in the Bay of Bengal. And it just looks like people are going to be there for many, many, many years. And it's just such a horrible tragedy.
Yeah.
So, and it's not really development in the sense of creating jobs and better education and trying to advance the way most countries advance over decades. It's really just trying to help people meet their basic needs and survive. And it's really sad. That's right.
Yeah. Okay, we have another question. Is there any hope that the Biden administration will devote development assistance to the Northern Triangle countries to help stem out migration?
I hope so. And they are working on that now. So the key people are not yet in place. We have a lot of the key people at the State Department in place, with the Secretary and many others. The lead person at USAID has not yet been confirmed, Samantha Powers, who was formerly the US ambassador to the United Nations and is really well equipped and highly equipped to do this. So I believe, from what I am hearing from my friends that are working in this, that this is going to be one of the priorities, that they recognize that while there are all kinds of really complicated border issues that we all know about, that part of this has to be to stem things at the source, and that has to be the long-term goal. So there is talk about reallocating. The issue, of course, is either you have to reallocate money from something else, which is always hard, or you got to go to Congress and get more money, and that's hard these days. But this is something that is being discussed within Latin America. I was actually on a call this morning, unrelated, completely unrelated to this, but with some people who work for the World Bank in Latin America, and they were saying that they believe that this is going to become a bigger area of focus, and that the World Bank is going to be focusing more money in Guatemala and Honduras for exactly this reason. So I hope, if it does, this is a 10 or 20 year project. This is not a 2 or 3 year project. This is a long-term project to build basic security institutions, to create jobs, to build the schools, and to protect it so that people feel safe at home. There's no short-term answer here. So I hope that's what happens.
Well, and I guess we have one final question, and it is, what do you predict will happen in terms of when we withdraw from Afghanistan? What effect will that have on our aid to that country?
I wish I knew. From Rick Scott. Hi, Rick. I shouldn't. I wish I knew. This is a huge question. It's the question of the day. I do think that President Biden was right to begin to pull it. I guess I would have done it over a little bit slower time frame, but we've been at this for a long time, and it's not working, and we're not making any progress. And having been involved in these discussions, actually, really, when I was at the U.S. Treasury when 9/11 happened, and then we invaded Afghanistan, and was part of the original interagency group working on Afghanistan so long ago, and we weren't making that kind of progress. So the aid programs are scheduled to continue. How successful they will be depends obviously on the security apparatus. There is a discussion actually of USAID increasing their funding to Afghanistan in light of the withdrawal, to help reinforce the education programs and the health programs. There's actually been enormous progress in some areas in Afghanistan, most notably girls' education. There's just a vastly higher share of girls that are actually getting through into school and completing school than there was 20 years ago. And that's one of the great things that has happened. But there's concern that that's all going to fall apart. So the initial discussions that I'm hearing is that they're going to push for an increase in aid, which of course is going to be a fraction of the money that we've been spending on the military side, to help shore up a lot of these programs. But all of that is going to depend on what happens after with the withdrawal, and the stability of President Ashraf Ghani's government, and what happens on that side, which of course I am in no position to predict, and I don't think anybody else is either. But it's a good question, Rick.
Well, I guess we'll have to wait and see.
Yep.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It's really been wonderful to have you with us, and we have learned a lot, and we appreciate your time and your expertise. And I'm sure you'll continue to do good work all around the world.
Well,
and
you're very kind. Thank you. Thank you for having me. I have to give a shout out. I see, I was just looking at the participant list, and I see a bunch of people that share my last name, which I guess are my relatives. So a shout out to all of them. Thanks for them coming. But thanks, Melanie, for inviting me and for having me. It's always fun to get such good questions, and thanks again to April for helping to put it together. Take care, everybody.
And thanks again. Bye-bye.
All right, bye-bye now.